Good evening, everyone. Is anyone here for the first time today? Well, we always have one person or another joining the group. That is wonderful. Welcome. Just to recap where we left off in our last meeting, we are reading this book. It is a book with 15 chapters, so we will have 15 gatherings. Today we are on the third one. The idea is to digest each chapter thoroughly, extracting what we are able to understand at this moment from Egyptian wisdom. So, those who have been coming regularly will need to have a bit of patience as we repeat these first 2 slides each time. Personally, I find this very valuable because even Homer and the Greek philosophers used to say that one should not begin anything profound without a certain consecration to beauty, without a certain elevation of consciousness. I believe it is very good for us to start with this poem because it sets exactly this as if it were a sacred tone, since we are speaking about what is most noble. Egypt produced one of the most noble things that Egypt produced, that was Hermetic knowledge. The laws of the Kybalion are a very bold proposition. Can you imagine what it means for a human being to set out to speak about the 7 laws that govern all the planes of the universe, manifested at any level you can conceive? In other words, in your mind, in your emotions, in the cosmos as a whole, everything, he says, is governed by laws that are all extensions of just 7 fundamental laws. He sets out to reveal what these 7 laws of the universe are. I find it interesting because you can more or less gauge the greatness of human beings by the life purpose they embrace, by the magnitude of their dreams. I always find it fascinating. When people recount the life of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, I imagine a 15-year-old boy when he sets a dream for his life. Generally, for the average person, what is it? Playing soccer? Going to Disney? At 15, Buddha set out to extinguish the suffering of humanity, to find a way out of human pain. I will do this, just this. I will find a way for human beings to suffer no more, that's it. An insignificant thing, any 15-year-old boy thinks about that. So, it's quite intriguing for us to realize that a person is as great as their dreams. Now, imagine a man who comes forward and says, I will speak about the ultimate laws of the manifested world. The 7 laws that govern everything, on every and all planes. What kind of person was he to set out on such a bold endeavor? So, this knowledge, which was carefully preserved through generations, resurfaces. At certain moments in human history, it re-emerges very strongly during the Middle Ages with the alchemists. Later, it resurfaces powerfully during the Renaissance with the Platonic Academy of Careggi in Florence. There, for the first time, this knowledge is translated into Latin. And then it disappears again, only to reappear sporadically at certain moments. Then you might say, no, today it is re-emerging, in quotation marks. Because the way people today revisit the knowledge of the past is not from the perspective of someone from that era, but rather through the lens of our current preconceptions. We see the world through a materialistic and utilitarian perspective. So, we tend to distort things. In other words, many of the principles of the Kybalion today have been turned into mental techniques for making money or getting a parking spot at the mall. You know what I'm talking about, right? It is almost a bit funny. What people do with this. In other words, using knowledge that was inherently altruistic, aimed at fraternity, to achieve personal gain is, at the very least, amusing. You will not understand this knowledge. I can guarantee you one thing, in my 28 years practicing philosophy, if you are someone who has read all of Plato's works, knows everything he said, but does not see the world with the same values that Plato did, you will understand almost nothing. But sometimes, a simple person, who shares more or less the same values that Plato had, who thought about the whole, before thinking of the individual. They were more fraternal, more altruistic than selfish. You say just a few things to this person, and they already position themselves better. Do you know why? They are here, Plato is here, but they are on the same axis. Therefore, they are seeing the world from the same perspective. In contrast, the person who has read everything, but is looking from a very unfocused angle. And sometimes, there are misunderstandings that are truly unfortunate. I have had the pleasant surprise of seeing my students, teenagers, since we teach philosophy to children as young as 4 years old. And it is fantastic. I have seen my teenage students give such impressive interpretations of Plato that they would leave many academic professors astonished. We have even had people come to the philosophy course, invited by a 9-year-old child. A 9-year-old boy gave me a philosophy lesson while we were in line, and he invited me, so I came. In other words, simplicity, but with a perspective similar to that of the author. I assure you, you will gain greater depth. So, I could say that after the Renaissance, it became very complicated to understand Hermes Trismegistus, because today's values have nothing to do with the values that prevailed in Egypt. Therefore, it becomes complex for us to position ourselves and truly understand, and there is a great deal of distortion regarding this. Iona. Well, the book we are discussing, which is this one, as you know, is right here. The Kybalion, in fact, is available for sale out there. You might say, oh, it's on the internet, and yes, it is. But if you consider, I am still a bit conservative, you know? If you print a little book like this, so inexpensive, nicely bound, so charming, I would much rather have the book on my bedside table. This book was written in 1908, remember, so it is not an ancient book. It is a book that draws from the tradition of the Emerald Tablet, the Hermetic Corpus, the Minerva Mundi, and everything that belonged to Hermes Trismegistus. It takes the fundamental phrases of the Kybalion and explains them in contemporary language. This is something risky. There is always the chance it could turn out to be a disaster. But if it is done well, it is an extraordinary gain. Because what it explains, we would not be able to understand on our own. I have already mentioned to you that there is another similar case, which is a book called The Art of Living, by the American writer Sharon Lerner, who takes the manual of the philosopher Epictetus, the Enchiridion, and translates it into contemporary language, but with remarkable success. She does an exceptionally well-crafted job. However, for these 2 successes, I could mention 30 failures. It is not something so easy to do. There have been people who tried to do the same thing with classic books, and it turned out to be a disaster. Because they do not understand, and therefore, when they transcribe, they project their own perspective and end up limiting the work. The Kybalion is a case of great success. It is an anonymous book. Whoever wrote it knew exactly what they were doing. Because it is very well done. So, we are discussing a book from 1908, based on the knowledge of the wise Hermes Trismegistus, who is believed to have lived sometime between 2600 and 1500 years before Christ. In other words, a considerable margin of uncertainty. No one is certain. In fact, there are even those who debate whether he actually existed. And today we are looking at Chapter 3. You may remember that we had our first meeting with the introduction in Topic 1. In a second meeting, all of that. Later, it will be available on the internet, with Topic 2, where he reviews the 7 laws. And now, in Topic 3, he will provide an introduction to the commentary on the first law. This first law, which he considers so important, is, in fact, the mental principle, the principle of mentalism, which states, the all is mind, the universe is mental. That is the principle, nothing more. He spends 2 chapters commenting on it, and only in the 3rd does he actually address the law itself. He believes there are some premises that you need to understand before moving on to the analysis of the law. So today he is going to talk about one of these premises, which is the matter of mental transmutation. This individual who wrote this book, fortunately, he wrote it in 1908, because in 1908, I believe, the last century, which isn't that long ago, just a century, there was already a bit of what we see today, the difficulty in accepting that our thoughts change, our values change, our concepts change. Because for an Egyptian, this would make no sense at all. He knew that things changed. In fact, he came here knowing that he had to change, that he had to improve himself, that he had to leave better than when he arrived. This was a given premise in their culture. Nowadays, we tend to live with the conformed syndrome. I was born this way, I grew up this way, this is just how I am, and I will always be this way. In other words, we believe that our minds, our values, are something rigid. I think we need one more chair here. We think that our values, our way of seeing the world, our emotions, we believe that the psyche, in general, is something rigid, predetermined, conditioned by certain environmental factors, and that we have no way to change. This is the most absurd of all absurdities, because we are here precisely to build ourselves. No construction in the world is as indispensable as this. Take a moment to reflect on that. There are certain things we think, oh my God, if we did not have them, what would we do? I think we would suffer a little, but we would manage. Can you imagine, for example, electricity? Whenever I think of something that would be difficult to live without, I remember electricity. Electricity brought an extraordinary improvement in our quality of life. But every now and then, the power goes out at home and no one dies because of it. We light a candle, move around, do what we need to do, and in the end, we get by. It is a bit uncomfortable, but we survived for centuries that way. If we didn't have, I don't know, airplanes or cars, that is fine too. We also survived for centuries without them. But when you do not have truly human beings, then no one survives. It turns into chaos. It becomes, as philosophy says, man is a wolf to man. Life becomes unlivable. In other words, the development of the human being is indispensable. The creation of things is desirable. It is, so to speak, a condition that brings a certain comfort. But look, losing our human condition is a price far too high to pay. So, mental transmutation, what does he say about this in the book at this point? The mind, just like metals and elements, can be transmuted from state to state, from degree to degree, from condition to condition, from pole to pole, from vibration to vibration. True Hermetic transmutation is a mental art. In other words, true Hermetic alchemical transmutation was not about turning lead into gold. It was about transforming crude, ignorant men into wise men. Turning beings who were almost animalistic into true human beings. That was the real transmutation. And since this law is based on the principle that the universe is mental, this transformation truly takes place within the mind. And then it is reflected on all levels, even in the posture of the human being. Today, we no longer know this as well. But it is said that these great sages of past civilizations, to some extent, modern psychology has recovered this, which is the observation of certain psychological traits of a person, by the way they walk, the way they sit, by their facial expressions. Today, even a person's handwriting is analyzed, graphology. There are companies that conduct this test before hiring someone, because in everything you do, there is a reflection of your mental state. But if you want to change, you will have to act at the source, at the origin, in your mental patterns, in the way you think about yourself, about life, and about others. And this change is possible. We are not a fixed reality, conditioned by our environment. Iona. We can rise above our environment and become anything we wish to be. So, this is one of the terrible ideas that we have been convinced of in what is called the contemporary world. Because we are supposedly entirely products of our circumstances. We allow ourselves to become products of our circumstances. Because it is more comfortable to have somewhere to place the blame for our mistakes. So, it's like the billiard ball syndrome. If I roll in the wrong direction, it was the cue's fault for pushing me. I am being pushed by life in every direction. I have no initiative and, therefore, no responsibility. It becomes easier that way. This is the collective syndrome of victimization that we experience. Despite this, it has been said that human beings can rise above their circumstances. And the proof of this is that there have been people who truly did so, even in extremely adverse circumstances. I really enjoy quoting. Those who have attended my lectures have probably heard me mention this, the Brazilian figure, Machado de Assis. Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis lived on a hillside. His mother died very early, when he was still a child. His father remarried. His father was illiterate, and when he died, he left Machado with his stepmother, Maria Inés, who was also illiterate and worked as a laundress. He was never able to attend school, he was self-taught. And what did Machado de Assis become in the Portuguese language as a whole, not just in Brazil? In other words, a person can rise above their circumstances. And what is most intriguing is that he lived in a time when determinism was in fashion. People believed that a person was a product of their environment, preferring theory over fact, even though Machado de Assis was right there for everyone to see. And people prefer theory over fact, they do not see the fact. They become blind, they become alienated, they act as if they were pre-programmed. And they cannot break free from this programming to see what life is offering. Were you going to ask something? No, we will talk a little about the difference between these two words. Sometimes we confuse them, use them interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Transformation comes from form. It changes merely the form, whereas transmutation is a change of essence. It's not that I just change the way I act with you and keep it all inside. Oh, such anger, such a desire to tell you something, some hard truths. No, I have changed my essence. And I have no desire to hurt you at all. I express the best of myself naturally, without any kind of pressure or any kind of internal repression. I really and truly am like this. Transmutation is the change in the very essence of things, whereas transformation is a change in form. And form can be the way we act, the way we speak as well, but it can also be merely a posture, a mask. See, I often mention this in our lectures. Recently, we had the case in the state of Espiritu Santo, which made this very clear. Notice how our ethics are often just a facade. When the rules are broken and there is no police presence, you can see the level of people out on the streets, breaking everything and stealing. Suddenly, people found themselves in a situation, and we have friends who live there, because there is a new Acropolis there, where they were afraid of their own neighbors. Can you imagine something like that? A middle-class person, all of a sudden, can become anything. Why is that? Because there is no consequence. Isn't that curious? That is a mask. A social veneer, but without any real depth. That is just a form. There is no essence behind it. In other words, it is an ethics of coercion, not of conviction. It is only form. That is exactly what he is going to talk about next, as I mentioned to you. Today, we have similar things, in a way, that remind us a bit of what was developed, for example, in Egypt. In Egypt, they spoke of astrology. Today, we speak of astronomy. Alchemy is now referred to as chemistry. Mystical psychology, although they did not use that term, meant that knowledge of the human being was the very first thing to be pursued. And today, psychology is, let's say, functional, applied to the facts of daily life. In other words, they had a different way of seeing things. Astrology did not only study the movement of the stars, but also why the stars move. Alchemy did not simply study the transformation of elements, but rather a positive transformation, one that would cause the elements to change for the better, not just in any direction. And mystical psychology was not concerned merely with helping a person achieve inner harmony, but with harmonizing both within and without, harmonizing oneself with the world. To be a useful part, a vital cell within a greater body. In other words, just as today we study physical processes, for example, a physical process is tearing a sheet of paper as simple as it seems, it changes the form. Chemical processes, on the other hand, are when you combine hydrogen and oxygen to form water. That is, something different is created, but under certain conditions, I can still reverse water back into hydrogen and oxygen. Alchemy was a process of essential and irreversible transmutation. The idea of turning lead into gold, or transforming the ignorant into the wise, is such that there is no way for the wise to become ignorant again. It is an essential change, one that cannot be undone, that cannot be reversed. Thus, they used alchemy in association with mystical psychology to achieve the definitive transmutation of beings into something higher on their evolutionary scale. They believed that the entire universe is in a state of evolution, and that beings, as they evolve, are committed to this process. Not only to their own evolution, but also to the evolution of everything around them. By your works, I will know you. In other words, I will be a more balanced person, but if I go through life leaving environments worse than they were before, dirtier, for example, well, it's strange that you are supposedly becoming a better person, while your actions are getting worse, isn't it? Because what do your actions come from? By your works, you will be known. So, it is only natural that if you are truly improving, the trail you leave behind should be brighter, your surroundings should become more beautiful, more harmonious. To such an extent that someone could look and say, a human being passed through here, it was not just any creature. To leave an environment with this, with that kind of energy, so to speak, with that harmony, it could not have been just any being who passed through here, it was a human being. In other words, there was a gain. If there is progress in one area, there must be progress in all areas. That is to say, both alchemy and mystical psychology spoke of human growth as being measured by the way a person helps all of nature to grow, and by their commitment to it. Now you might ask, why didn't they talk about atoms? Why didn't they mention the periodic table? If they had so much knowledge? That is what I pointed out below, right? This does not mean that they ignored contemporary knowledge. Of course, we will not say that Egypt had technology that modern man has, or that applied science was at this level. It wasn't. But they could have devoted all their attention to this and perhaps developed it greatly if that had been their interest. And I will share with you the example from the book, which, in my case, comes from Professor George Angel Livraga, the founder of New Acropolis, who gives a very interesting example. Imagine that this was a leather-bound book, one of those beautifully bound editions. I know everything about this book. I know exactly the molecular composition of the cellulose that gave rise to this paper, and of the pigment that produced this ink. I can even tell you the chemical formula of the pigment. I can tell you exactly how the leather for the cover was extracted and tanned. The pigment of the golden letters, I know its composition as well. I can define all of this for you precisely. Everything that is in this book, materially speaking. But there is one thing I do not know. These symbols inside here are more than just pigments applied to cellulose. I do not know how to put these symbols together and form a sentence whose meaning points to something beyond what is here. I do not know how to read the book. Do you get this? It's something truly astonishing. And if you tell me that by reading this, it will speak to you about something out there in the universe, something that isn't here, you'll say, you are crazy. There is nothing like that here. All there are here are some little black marks made with pigment, that's all. You are making it up. The Egyptians were not so concerned with defining pigment and cellulose, but they cared about reading the book of life. And this refers to all of life. It is something that can be read. It is a grammar. Life itself, the symbolism of life. It is a grammar, one that can be read. If you bring together the events of your life, the harmony of the facts that accompany you, you read life itself. It leads you to a reality that exists elsewhere. Oh no, I know which law made this book fall. It is gravity. I know the definition of the law of gravity. I know a lot of technical things, but I don't know what life is trying to tell me with this, nor do I even believe that it is trying to say anything. Do you understand this? In other words, there is a kind of vital illiteracy. For Egypt, it was more important to read the book than to technically define its materials. And that is a bit of what we do today. We technically define everything, but what is everything? Why? We know the know-how. We know how to do things. To know what I will use it for, we are utilitarian, but the reason behind things themselves, we do not know. Our way of defining things, pause to reflect on this. If I ask you what a house is, what a wall is, what a chair is, you define them as, it is for me to live in, it is for me to sit on. In other words, you define things by the utility they have for you, and not by what they are in themselves, as if things were created solely to satisfy your desires. We do stop to consider that things themselves are evolving. And they are just as important as we are, and have the same right to exist in the universe as we do. There is a phrase from a Russian writer that says the following: there are those who walk through a forest and see only firewood for their own fire. Tolstoy. There are those who walk through a forest and see only firewood for their own fire. That is more or less how we relate to things. What is the forest in itself? If I didn't exist, what would it be? In itself, as a being that is evolving, it has just as much right to be here as I do. Do you realize that we do not think this way? It is about knowing how, knowing for what purpose, and knowing where to go. Know. And for the Egyptians, this was the most important thing, so they focused their energy on transcendence. Toward the meaning of life, toward the interpretation of life, and to see where it was pointing, what it wanted to tell you. Because life is a grammar, communicating with you through symbols. There is a content behind the scenes of life, being transmitted to you through events. Remember that example I have given 1,000,000 times, that everyone already knows by heart, about the line. We are in a line, and it doesn't move. You switch to another one, then the one you were in starts moving, but the one you just joined doesn't, and so on. At the bank, at the supermarket, everywhere. It's always a silly example, but it works well, so I always use it. Then you say, it is just a coincidence. I am an unlucky person. You won't learn anything that way. Why is life putting me in this situation? Could it be suggesting that I need to be more patient? Maybe to have less self-importance, to be less vain? Then I come up with a possible answer, and I reposition myself in relation to life. That situation stops happening. Ah, I got it right. Then something else happens. You come up with a new way to interpret it. Do you know what will happen? There will come a moment when you become curious to discover who is the interlocutor communicating with you behind the scenes of life through this language. Because life is very intelligent. It is truly intelligent. This is a language. It has phonemes. It has an entire linguistic structure. Life is communicating with you. So, the Egyptians prioritized reading life itself rather than technically defining the material components of life. And their energy was directed toward this purpose. And they achieved results that were consistent with what they sought. Our historical moment is different. We seek a different kind of result. Building the human being and deeply understanding life are no longer our goals. That is why it is so difficult to understand Egypt. To transform versus to transmute, as I mentioned to you, are different things. It is not that we deny this. Transformation has its value. In other words, I practice discipline so that I no longer behave the way I used to. All right, that is a beginning. But if I do not internalize this through reflection on the reason behind this action, on what it adds to the world, if it is merely a mask, at some point, that mask will break, and what I truly am will come to the surface, as in the state of a Espírito Santo case. And do not think it is only Espírito Santo. Some time ago, this happened in London as well. Do you remember that? Very similar in what we consider to be the first world. This means that our civilization, no matter what level it is at, is superficial. Materialism does not allow for depth, because not everything within us is material. So, materialism only reaches that which is material. It creates a rigid mask, but not an infallible one. At some point, it breaks. And what lies behind it is revealed, your true values. You are what you do when the last door closes behind you. Well, then, mental transmutation, mental alchemy. The author of this book will say that it is the most important study ever developed. Certainly, because we came into this world to become more human. That is what nature is expecting from us. And to become more human, the first thing we must do is to envision what it means to be a human being, to have an ideal, and to work with daily discipline to reach it. In other words, to know where I want to go and to set myself in motion, without haste and without pause. Without stopping in that direction. And this is mind. Inner life is nothing more than mastery of the mind. And it is inner life that brings about our qualification as human beings. Outer life leads to survival. Inner life gives rise to true life. Human life with a capital H. So, he says, this is one of the most important principles, if not the most important ever stated in the history of humanity. Ah, but there is gravity, there is relativity, I don't know what else, there are Newton's laws. Without these, we would still live, but not as human beings. We are all condemned, and we are truly experiencing this now. We know what it means to live in such a brutalized society. In such a context, no real life is possible. We regress to an animalistic stage panic. Panic versus aggressiveness. The universe is mental. So, if you believe, and he explains this very well, we are in chapter 3 now, and in chapter 5, he will explain why the universe is mental. He goes so far as to develop a logical equation to prove to you that the universe does not exist materially. What we see here is an illusion. The only thing that truly exists is the mind. But this is not the moment for that yet. However, he will say that if the universe is mental, then all planes, including the physical, exist within the mind. It is a fleeting illusion. So, if you want to change something, start with what is real. Otherwise, you will not accomplish anything significant. There will be no lasting transformation. It will only be a temporary relief. In fact, Eastern medicine, such as Indian Ayurveda, taught that health works the same way. Similarly, the medicine of Asclepius, Seriphus in Egypt, Asclepius in Greece, followed the same principle. It was the same idea. You must seek the origin of your problem in the subtle planes, mental and emotional, because otherwise, you are only treating the physical organ affected. It is as if these forces break through your physical body. The physical body is the organ of impact. You have closed off one point where these forces were overflowing. But they will break through somewhere else, because the forces that caused the imbalance in your health have not stopped acting. And the physical plane is merely an organ of impact for reality, which is fundamentally mental. Therefore, you are only applying a temporary remedy. In a moment, we will give an example that clearly illustrates this. Do you remember that scene from the movie The Matrix? Matrix, however you prefer to pronounce it, were those two siblings, whose names I can't recall right now, created the film. They drew inspiration from Buddhism and outlined this concept very well. Do you remember the boy with the spoon? Do you remember that? When he enters the house of the... And he asks, how do you do that? I just don't believe this is real. So I do whatever I want with it, because I know it is not real. Since I know it is not real, I have control over it. And then, at the end, why does that character? By the way, we have a lecture about this movie on YouTube, if you are curious. Why does Neo, or however you want to call him, does not die at the end when they shoot him inside the Matrix? Why? Because he knows that he wasn't really there, that place. It is just a mere shadow. We are not truly here. This is just a mere shadow. He was aware of reality, that in essence, he was not even there. Therefore, you could not kill him if, in fact, he was not even there. That is a very well-crafted symbolism they created to show that a person who is aware of their own essence masters matter. And he will talk a lot about this. Because when we see those events, Moses parting the Red Sea, Jesus Christ walking on water, every tradition has this kind of story. We call them stories, so to speak. Legends. Look, there is a symbolic aspect, but there is also something real about them. These masters, at this level of wisdom, truly have mastery over matter. Matter is merely an illusion projected by the mind. And they are genuinely capable of producing things that, to us, would seem impossible. Every tradition has its own stories. This is what he will discuss further ahead. Mental transmutation is the art of changing the conditions of the universe in the realms of matter, force, and mind. So, a person who truly has the ability to master the mental plane possesses an extraordinary capacity to influence the material plane. But these are only the top ones, the powerful sages, the truly great, who act directly upon matter. He says that minor sages or philosophers influence matter through their minds. When the mental pattern changes, the body will act differently. But there is the possibility that a great master of wisdom can act directly upon matter. Just today I read an Indian tradition, since we are familiar with many Western traditions, but there is a book in the Indian tradition, which is the life of Milarepa, that tells the story of the sage, pardon me, not Indian, but Tibetan. Milarepa, who is a founder of one of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, is said to have performed fantastic wonders in the material world. He was capable of producing storms, stopping storms, and doing things like that. In general, these masters do not engage in displays of power because they are free from vanity, but they do possess this ability to act upon matter. If we stop to think about it, it is not something so absurd or legendary after all. Imagine our body, if we go to the ultimate instances of what makes up the organic matter of our body. It is made up of cells, which in turn are made up of molecules, which in turn are made up of atoms. A carbon atom, for example, which is very present in our body, if you study the mutation of elements in the periodic table, you know that an atom, in 70 years, almost nothing happens to it. 70 years is no time for an atom. For an element to transform on the periodic table, it takes a universe of time. In other words, if an atom does not change at all in 70 years, why do we, who are made up of atoms, change so much? Have you ever stopped to think about that? Do you realize that, in truth, it is as if there were a kind of software on a subtle plane, directing the atoms to organize themselves differently? Because as humans, up to 2 years old we are one way, up to 5 another, up to 10 another, and in the first year of life we grow at such a speed that, if we kept growing at that rate, we would become giants. Then, afterwards, it slows down, and eventually shrinks at the end. In other words, a kind of software, something on the mental plane. That tells a dog to behave differently. A dog at 15 years old is already old, while we are still in the prime of life. So, a software on the mental plane, a law of life, causes the atoms to behave in this way. It is as if there were a magnet, a sheet of paper, and iron filings. The filings obey what the magnet below is directing. In other words, there are laws on the mental plane, and matter organizes itself by following this command. In other words, reality exists on the mental plane. Now, imagine if a person with such profound knowledge of the mental plane were able to make a small change in this software. You have probably heard of great individuals throughout history, whom we often think of as legends, who were able to achieve much greater longevity. They could slow down the aging process because they had a mission to fulfill in the world. We hear about this, even Trismegistus himself. The Egyptian tradition said that he lived for 300 years. It might be a legend, but then again, maybe it is not entirely so. So, according to these traditions, there are people with this level of wisdom. Who am I to say whether they exist or not? But these traditions from all over the world say that there are people capable of acting on the mental plane and directly influencing matter. But on a smaller scale, what do? We act upon our own mind, and our mind acts upon our body, and the body behaves differently, whether in ourselves or in others. It is an indirect way, but it still ends up causing transformations in matter just the same. This is simpler, and it is what we see happening. Did you want to ask something? Actually, the mental plane has two sides. It is as if you imagine a mirror facing downward or facing upward. The mental plane is a modus operandi for understanding the world around us. But it can do this either for material objectives, which is the mirror facing downward, or for spiritual objectives, which is the mirror facing upward. So, when he speaks of the mind in this sense, he is referring to a pure mind, oriented upward. Because the mind oriented downward is like the executive of a large company, he uses the mind as well. But it is a mind used to operationalize his personal success, his selfishness. But it is the same modus operandi. Step by step, dividing and understanding. Is there any piece of paper here so I can explain this to you? Yes, this one still has some blank space. That's one less comment I will receive. The mind is a way of understanding the manifested world around us. Now, the mind has a particular characteristic. It divides in order to understand. It divides, and then I understand. Isn't that right? There is a chair in my house. It is square, it is yellow, it is soft. You start removing what it is not in order to visualize it. I understand. Imagine if I tried to explain to you a chair I have at home, but it is big, yet it is also small. It is square, but it is also round. It is yellow, but it is also blue. You would say, enough? Take something away, for the love of God, because we cannot understand. The mind divides in order to understand. It has its own way, it reasons. It is mediated by reasoning. It is said that there is another way of understanding within human beings, which is intuition. Intuition does not divide, it unites. It unifies. I see. It only perceives things as a whole. And it is not mediated by anything, it is automatic. It is another way of understanding. But the mind is one and the same. What changes is the master it serves. When it works for matter, it works for the spirit. Continuing, he goes on to say that the minor disciples, that is, those of us with less wisdom, closer to what we understand, closer to our ordinary knowledge, also change. But they change through the mind. So, I change my way of thinking. Naturally, this changes my feelings, changes my energies. It will affect the health of my body and will transform the world. But this is mediated by the denser vehicles, and not immediately, producing phenomena like the great masters do. But this also changes the world. If you change the way people think, you change the world. He says that this is very much in vogue, and this was in 1908. He had no idea what would happen 100 years later. These practices of mental exercises, mentalism, and mental concentration to obtain things, if they were already in vogue in 1908, today, as people popularly say, they have truly pumped up. There are so many movements, films, and practices centered around this. But he says, look, these practices of mastering the mind to obtain things are not as effective as you might think. Because for a mental practice to truly have an effect, a person would have to be very pure. Working with mental practices is like increasing the brightness of this room so that it can better illuminate the floor. I have enhanced my mental capacity. All right, the light has been intensified. But if I don't remove the objects that are in the way, the light won't reach the floor. Instead, it will cast shadows. Do you understand? So, I increase the light, but if the path is still full of dirt, I will not have more light in my life. I will have the shadows of many things. Therefore, for mental mastery to truly result in a higher quality of human life, in more humane beings, purification must accompany it. Otherwise, you will encounter what is very common in our current times. There are executives, people from major companies, with a work capacity that is truly remarkable and an incredible mental focus, ingenious, creative individuals. This world of major corporations, even Steve Jobs himself said he worked with ease, about 15 or 16 hours a day, with an extraordinary, explosive level of mental activity. But if materialism, selfishness, and vanity are not cleansed, what will be projected into the world? If not, the result will be merely material works, very fleeting, that 2 or 3 years after his passing are already outdated. It does not significantly change the life of humanity, and sometimes it can even bring about loss, depending on the character behind it. Do you understand? So, concentration, imagination, channeling of mental forms, these are good. But if there is no purification, if there is no humanization, no cultivation of deeper and more human values, you might have a genius producing disasters. And when a person has a distorted character, isn't it better for their mind to be weak? It is better for a criminal to be unfocused. Don't you agree? It is better if they have no imagination. Criminals, it would be better if they had no imagination at all. Because if they do, it is a disaster. An imaginative criminal is the worst thing there is. So, these things do not have value in themselves, but rather in how you use them. And for that, there shouldn't be crude, personalistic obstacles along the way. In other words, one should not engage in practices of mental mastery without a solid foundation in character development, purification, and morality. Building of values. Because otherwise it becomes counterproductive. It can turn against humanity. That is what he is saying. And today, this has become the latest trend. I told you about the story, and you know what I am referring to. Stories of mental practices to get a parking spot at the mall. This is no joke. You must have seen this before. The person takes a $1 bill, adds a bunch of zeros to it, sticks it to the ceiling of their room, above the bed they sleep, opens their eyes in the morning and stares at it, focusing their mind. These are mental mastery practices aimed at obtaining $1 million. Haven't you seen this? It can't be that you have left me to be shocked by this all by myself. I won't mention any names out of discretion, but let's be honest. This really happened, and it was quite recent. There was a huge trend around this. I don't know, because I still cannot find a parking spot at the mall, so I cannot vouch for the truth of it, but the trend definitely existed. Now, he moves on to another piece of information, which is very interesting. Our chapter today is quite short. We are almost finished. He goes on to say the following: it is possible to change, consciously or unconsciously, another person's mental state if they are defenseless, and this can create real consequences in practical life. There are 2 serious things here, or maybe 3, or who knows how many. It is possible to change, consciously and unconsciously, another person's mental state. Do you know what that means? Who you are, whether you want it or not, spreads outwards. If you have a very negative mental attitude, it radiates. You might say, no, but I haven't spoken to anyone. I don't want anyone to know about this. I don't want to affect anyone with my hatred, for example. But you can be sure that you really are. What you constantly nurture within yourself radiates outward and affects all of humanity. It is like the story of the swimming pool, which is also an example I often use. Imagine placing several human beings in a swimming pool. If one person has a skin disease, it spreads to everyone. That is why we have to do a skin check before entering the pool. Now, imagine that the mental plane works in the same way. It is like a vast mental swimming pool. And we are all inside it together. A very negative mental form from someone in Japan, for example, can currently manifest in our own minds. At any moment, it is wandering through the mental plane. And well, if a person is very easily influenced and adopts negative behavior because you contributed to it, then part of the responsibility is yours. In India, they call this karma. Those whom we influence, whether for good or for bad, a portion of their pain is our responsibility. That is negative karma. Those who, through your example, behave badly, part of their suffering is your fault. It is your karma. You will have to suffer along with them. Imagine that. Do you understand? This is one of the extremely complex aspects of our educational process, for example, which would make no sense at all to the classical world. Plato talks about this when he defines education in a very interesting way. Imagine an excellent mathematics teacher, someone who knows how to teach math very well, but in their private life, they are addicted to drugs, their life is completely out of balance, and they are aggressive. When a child admires this teacher because of their skill in mathematics, don't they tend to think that, in order to be that competent, they must live the way the teacher lives? Do you see how this person spreads their own vices through their effectiveness? And for someone who has so many vices, it would be better if they were a poor mathematics teacher. Because it is less harmful for a child not to know mathematics than to be exposed to that kind of influence in life. Through who we are, in some way, through our effectiveness, through our virtues, the virtues we inspire and spread these qualities, creating examples that tend to be followed. And the suffering of those who make mistakes because they followed us is our responsibility. In a certain way, they are all our children. It is a family. The whole of humanity is our family, and it is our responsibility, whether we do this consciously or unconsciously, and generally, it is unconsciously. In our case, to some extent, no one stands around thinking, I will harm you. That is not something common. But if we nurture vices, we are accepting the fact that this may contaminate others. And the more efficient we are in our work, in anything, the more space you give for the propagation of what lies behind your virtues. Greater reach, greater impact. And people are very intuitive. They do not perceive only what you are saying, they perceive everything that you are. And everything that you are spreads. An apple tree produces apples, there is no other way. And if we are coarse, we spread coarseness. If we are selfish, we spread selfishness, whether we want to or not. There is an interesting detail here that he points out. This can change the other person's mental state if they are unprotected, and generate real consequences in practical life. In other words, I can change your mental state. If you are not attentive, if you are defenseless. And most of us are defenseless on the mental plane, which is no small matter. Remember the story about the big swimming pool. When a person becomes wise, as the wise say, it is as if they have built a wall around their emotional and mental planes. Nothing gets in here, only what I allow is present. They create their own world, where they know perfectly well what belongs to them and what does not. We do not have that complete sense of identity. So, constantly, the thoughts and feelings of those around us end up entering into us. There is no way around it. At our level, there is no way. So, how can we develop a true sense of identity? Do you know how? You deliberately take a sheet of paper and write. Who am I? I am a person who thinks this way, who has these principles, who holds these feelings. Anything different from this script is not me. And therefore, I want to identify myself. Then, a negative mental form appears, criticism, anger. You see it coming, you cannot stop it from entering, so you say, this is not mine. Welcome, criticism. Goodbye, criticism. Until next time, criticism. Go away. You don't form bonds with it. Just as it comes in, it leaves. Go away. You don't feed it. Now, if criticism comes and you don't have an identity, you will say, why am I thinking this? Oh, maybe it's because yesterday he treated me a certain way. That's what made me feel like this. Then you take that, claim it, and create a history. It takes root, and soon it really becomes yours. A sadness. Hasn't this happened to you? Nothing happened in your life. Suddenly, a sadness appears. It could belong to anyone among 7 billion human beings. Forgive me. Most likely, it is from someone emotionally closer to you. but it could be from anyone. If you don't have an identity, you will take this on as your own. Why am I sad, anyway? Oh, it's because when I was little, my mother said something to me, so I must have a Freudian trauma. In other words, I have already created roots, formed bonds with that feeling. But that wasn't necessary. Look, there is a sadness passing through here. Goodbye, sadness. If you dwell on it too much, if it becomes necessary, you might even discover who it belongs to. By observing, if you get used to perceiving people through their gaze, you might realize, oh, it was her who lost the sadness. I can feel that it comes from her. If you have a strong sense of identity, a lot of purity, if you truly know who you are, that is intelligence, intelliger, is choosing from within, choosing from among the things you are not, who you truly are. By definition, this is an active will, a discipline. I am this, this, and this. Anything outside of that is not me. Someone has lost their sadness here. Who was it? In other words, you might even find the owner. And you do not identify with the things that come and go. They do not remain. This protects you. If you lack identity, if you do not know what truly belongs to you amidst this world of noise and information, anything projected onto you will stay and take root. He will then dedicate a chapter to discussing this, which is about mental manipulation. How people throw out ideas and you develop them, believing they are your own. You create a history for them and think they belong to you, but they weren't. They were ideas that were cast out. There is an entire chapter where he will talk about this, which is the mental gender. Would you like to ask something, Franklin? Actually, when you speak, let me move to a place where I can see you behind the pillar. When you speak about depression, you are already entering a realm that is very somatic. Your body is already responding. Because it is as if there were a pendulum. We have a psychic center. I am not a teacher of this subject. I am a philosopher. You have a psychic center, and there is a degree of oscillation that remains within your control. Sadness or joy, these are within your domain. You do not lose contact with your identity. But if you do not take care of this, it will generate an increasingly exacerbated eccentricity. There comes a certain point when it becomes pathological, because it's somatic. Certain psychological illnesses, if you perform a physical examination on the person, you can detect them. The behavior of hormones, the behavior of the physical body, is already altered. At that point, physical treatment will be necessary. On your own, you probably will not have the willpower to reverse it. This is not a bad thing. It can be reversed. There is nothing wrong with physical treatment. But it would be good for us to stay alert when things start to go too far. When we begin to lose contact with our center. When these reactions start to become too exaggerated, because our society lacks criteria. Today, everyone goes to extremes on the emotional level. It is even seen as a good thing. It is considered a sign of a strong personality. From the Eastern point of view, my friends, this is one of the most curious things in the world. They believe that you have a human being, and beneath that, there is an animal, which is the part that interfaces with the world. And this animal, which interacts with survival in the world, is the personality. And you have your human self above that. So, when someone comes to you and says, I have a strong personality, what they are really telling you is, I have a weak essence. It is like a rider saying, I have a strong horse. In that case, the rider is not doing well, because the one who should be strong is the rider, who is supposed to control the horse. Do you understand? The person takes pride in this. Oh, if you do such a thing to me, I turn into a beast. But, for the love of God, are you really proud of turning into a beast? Do you realize that we take pride in things that, in other historical moments, would be shameful? If I turn into a beast, I should hide it, not let anyone see. If your personality is strong, you hide it. It is a sign that your true self is weak, so don't go around spreading it. But we put this on display. So, these excesses sometimes turn into pathologies, which then really require physical intervention, and you need a doctor. Because when it reaches a somatic level, then you need a doctor, as it alters the entire structure of the organism. Well, in any case, being a person who has defenses means being someone with identity and the discipline to manage that identity every single day. Without haste and without pause, every day I check whether my life is consistent with what I am, and I am because I have defined it. I am because I choose to be. There is a little scheme, very simple and even a bit rough, but it can help you get an idea of this. Imagine that within you there is a being. Our essence, the one we are trying to discover, the being that stands above the animal, the rider in relation to the horse. No one ever taught us what this truly is. Perhaps we are not living in a historical moment that is very focused on this. We have a personality that surrounds this, which is well, we have a personality, but we do not have a pen, but that's all right. Which is the appearance. Do you notice that this appearance sometimes has nothing to do with being? Everyone seems to be the same thing. It's a massification. It's about appearing as what is fashionable. Everyone acts the same way, thinks the same way, feels the same way. The appearance, which is the personality, is sometimes so distorted by the environment. The person becomes so outwardly focused, has so little internal dialogue, searches so little for themselves, that this appearance sometimes becomes a completely distorted mask, identical for everyone. The same behaviors, the same feelings, the same way of reacting. Then you come with an external element, which is the desire to be. Which is what philosophy builds. Philosophy is exactly that. It is the desire to be. I want to be generous. But you are being fake, because you are not like that. My inner being is, what isn't is my personality. I want to be a harmonious person. I want to be someone who considers the feelings of others. Otherwise, you are just forcing it. You are not really like that. I am not forcing it. I am like that. It is my personality that is distorted. So, this discipline that you build by definition, that checklist you make, is actually more like your true self than your spontaneity. Because your spontaneity has been deformed by habit. It has been deformed by culture. Do you understand? Your will is closer to who you truly are than your spontaneity. Spontaneity is not who you are. If I had been born in another historical moment, I would be something else entirely. It is a conditioning of the environment. Discipline is more aligned with your true self than just letting life take you wherever it wants. As the samba song says, and this construction is exactly what he refers to as identity. My checklist. Why am I who I am? Because I choose to be. I am generous, therefore, the selfish thought does not belong to me. Whose selfishness is this? It's not mine. I am what? Altruistic, because I want to be, I have defined it for myself. Does my checklist reflect this? Does my personality? No. That's why we need to rethink our concept of spontaneity. Sincerity is fidelity to what is true. And what is true is this, not that. Spontaneity, if you look it up in Aurelio, is to act in accordance with who you are. Isn't that what spontaneity is? I am spontaneous when I act in accordance with who I am. Therefore, in order to be spontaneous, I would need to know what I am and not how I am. Because this, in general, has nothing to do with who I truly am. It comes from family conditioning, cultural influences, environmental factors, and many other sources. If I had been born on the other side of the world, perhaps it would be different. This is not me, this is an external construction. And sometimes, it violently wounds and blocks my true self. Therefore, I am spontaneous when I am faithful to my true self, not to these external constructs. And for this, there is philosophy. You relate directly, by definition. This is the construction of identity. Why am I like this? Because I choose to be. I made a little list. I am this. Because I want to be. And don't think this is forced. This is real. What is forced is that other thing. It is the mask. Do you understand this idea? And this protects you. Because then you already have an element that defines what you are and what you are not. Therefore, discernment means differentiating the essence of things. You already have an element of definition, because until then, there would be no way to know to whom a thought or feeling that enters your mind belongs. This is a philosophical construction. This is not just for sages. This is for philosophers, lovers of wisdom, and it is perfectly plausible. And this protects you from mental manipulations, which is what happens most often. You don't need to have superpowers, not at all. Today, we have many ways to instill ideas without people even noticing. And before long, there is an entire group thinking the same way, and they believe they were the authors of those thoughts. That they were the builders, they were actually conditioned. And finally, to conclude, mentalism is the basic principle of Hermeticism. It is the most important of the 7 principles of the Kybalion. It is mentalism. At New Acropolis, we often tell a story. We usually tell our students, a story I created for my students many years ago, to explain why philosophy is about volunteering. People today have such a materialistic mindset that they think social volunteering is merely charity, which is a good thing. We do practice charity. But it's not just that, and perhaps that's not even the main point. And it has a lot to do with this principle of mentalism, which is the story of the puddle. Some of you may already know it. I used to say, imagine you have a leaky roof, and that leak has created a puddle of water here on the floor. Then, you divide humanity into 3 groups. The first group is the group of the alienated. They trample everything, make a muddy mess, and don't care about it at all. The second group is the group of well-intentioned people who come here, look at this, and say, someone has to do something. They grab a cloth, grab a mop, clean everything, use detergent, and clean the floor. Did I solve it? No, it wasn't solved, because the leak continues. Soon enough, the puddle is there again. Soon, the troop of the oblivious comes along, tramples everything, and fills it all with mud again. Then a third group arrives. So, you could say that the well-intentioned are indeed well-intentioned, but they are not effective. And a third group would be the philosophical mindset. The philosopher, at first, will clean the floor, because you cannot have a discussion in the middle of the mud. But the next question he will ask is, where is this coming from? He will look up and see a leak in the roof. He goes up there, fixes the tiles, the flashing, the slab, repairs everything. Once the leak is fixed, the puddle is gone. With the puddle gone, the mud disappears as well. Notice that this act of looking upward is highly symbolic. Only the fool believes that the causes of physical misery are found on the physical plane. The causes of physical misery have always been, and will always be, rooted in the psychological, moral, and spiritual dimensions of humanity. I always use examples to illustrate this. In this case, misery. Is it a lack of material goods, or is it a lack of fraternity? Is hunger a lack of food, or a lack of honesty? You realize that what is truly lacking is up there, on the mental, emotional, and human psychic planes. And the deficiencies you experience down here are merely puddles of water, mere consequences. And it is not wrong to dry up the puddle, but that is only a necessary condition. However, it is not a sufficient condition, it is only a temporary remedy. You cannot solve the world's problems if you do not act up there, on the plane of values, in the way that humanity thinks and feels about the world. And this is the principle of mentalism. Philosophy operates in this realm, and that is why it is indeed a work of volunteering, as one of the most necessary in today's world. We are no longer living in times where temporary solutions are enough. In fact, we never were. We must address the root causes. It means acting on the causes, working on the mental plane, starting with ourselves, so that we can be examples of transformation and prove that change is possible. It means going against the current of the masses. To think, to feel, and to live as a true human being. Well, that is our chapter for today. As I mentioned to you, it is quite brief, so the principle of the chocolate cake applies even more strongly. Savoring a small slice of chocolate cake usually takes longer, if truly enjoyed, than reading 3.5 pages. Therefore, it will be very difficult for you to convince yourselves that you didn't have enough time, because I will not believe. I truly hope that you are able to read it, while the content is still fresh, so you can connect what you have heard with what you are reading and generate questions. The idea is for us to have a study group. This is not a conventional lecture. This is a different mindset, because sometimes people feel a bit shy, afraid to expose themselves, but it becomes much more productive. If you read, if you bring questions, it greatly expands our understanding, much more than simply listening to an oral presentation from me. So, I am counting on you for next week to read Chapter 4. Ideally, you would read it beforehand. If you couldn't, well, read it afterwards, read it at some point. But the idea is that you follow along by reading. All right? Any other questions, everyone? So, that is it. I truly appreciate your presence. So many people on a Thursday after Carnival is really amazing. Next week we meet again. Thank you.